All right, so here we go with a nice little video lecture on motivation. Motivation is one of our naughtiest topics in all of AP Psych. Why? Because human beings are motivated by and to do a whole variety of things. And again, we sort of run the gamut from things that you'd be quite comfortable telling mom and dad about to things that we don't even think about. But they're all a part of it. Let's start like taking the overall look, the evolutionary theory. I mean, the idea that there are certain things that all human beings everywhere in all cultures, whether they've had any contact with each other or not, they're motivated to do things, and that really gets into instinct. Drive reduction theory, and I want you to remember this because it's something that people get confused. Drive means biological. In other words, you have a biological need and the goal is to eliminate or soften that homeostasis, as you see. The arousal theory, now that's a different thing because you're obviously motivated by something. For example, drive reduction theory, I'm so hungry, so I eat. What if you just ate 3 pizzas and somebody walks in with brownies? Well, you don't have a biological urge to need, but it's there anyhow. And you're looking for that level of optimal arousal, that perfect level of excitement. Again, not just talking sexual, but that as well too. And Abraham Maslow, who we met in the last unit, his hierarchy of needs, hierarchy of motives, some things more important than others. Yeah, again, drive reduction theory. What we're looking at here, once again, is biological. Instinct theory is obviously there. It explains a lot of things. There are instincts, but it doesn't quite explain a lot of behavior. You need water, thirst, etc. What do? You have this drive, which is the hunger, the thirst, and you eat or you drink. So anything, again, that is biological, it's a biological need that you need to take the edge off, that's drive reduction. What's an incentive? You know what? It can be a positive or negative stimuli. Remember that positive and negative is usually a mathematical thing. In other words, something good. It's something that can push you towards something or pull us in the other direction. So, for example, the smell of baked goods, for example, pull you in a direction. A very unpleasant odor pushes you away. So it can be positive or negative. Intrinsic, and this is important to think about, intrinsic. You do something because you want to do it for its own sake. Extrinsic, you're rewarded by some external factor. This can be anything from applause to money to a grade, etc., etc. There is sometimes a naive belief that all learning must be intrinsically motivated and grades don't matter. Well, it doesn't really work like that. If there's something that you're genuinely interested in, you're genuinely motivated in, yes, it's not about that. If we have any musicians in the class, yes, it might be that you enjoy the applause, you enjoy hearing good things from mom or dad or making them happy that you're continuing to play, but you're genuinely interested. I know we have a lot of intrinsically motivated learners here. Yeah, the grade is important. That's great. You want to get into a good university, and there are things you just find fascinating, and you spend time reading this. We do know that intrinsic motivation is more likely to continue, but often it takes extrinsic motivation. Many of you didn't know that you were interested in psychology. You thought maybe this wasn't going to work for you. Well, I got a quiz coming up. I have to study for it. I guess I need to do well. Hey, this is really interesting. And some of you may spend the summer reading about this type of stuff with no grade involved. The over-justification effect, I swear, remember we've talked about this. It would make sense that there's somebody in this room who loves to dance. You are a trained modern dancer. This is what you do. It is your passion. You go to bed at night thinking about how awesome it is. And then if we say, you know what, we want you to really, really be dancing more. We're going to give you $10 every time you go to a class. Now, it is true, in the short run, it might be that instead of going 3 days a week, you might think, I'm going to go 4 days a week because that's $40 a month, $50 a month. In the long run, though, the motivation to continue it seems to be less. And you might stop the video for a second and say, why is it that paying somebody for something that they already enjoy makes them less likely to continue doing it, at least in the long run? Okay, if you've restarted the video, let me offer up a couple suggestions and note to yourself if you thought of them. One is that if you're paying somebody to do something, there's maybe a sense that it's work, that, well, you know, if I have to do it, I guess if I'm getting paid for it. The other thing too is that the extrinsic motivation stops. Remember that we're very driven by relative ideas of what's good or what is not. And if I used to get paid $10 for going to a class, well, I'm not getting paid anymore, so that's not going to be a permanent arrangement. And there might be a sense of feeling like, you know, I'm just not getting what I used to, feeling like you're entitled to it. So yeah, it's called the over-justification effect. It loves to appear on AP Psych essays. We have looked at Mr. Maslow's, the humanistic psychologist, his hierarchy of needs. Remember that term self-actualization, that does tend to appear on a lot of these exams. But the idea is like, and Maslow is not simple enough to say that if you're slightly hungry, you don't care at all whatsoever about beauty or being loved. Of course, it doesn't work like this. What he is arguing, though, is that if you're somebody who's been at the very, very bottom of this and you can't focus on other needs, you don't have the time, the mental bandwidth, as it were, to really think about these bigger issues out there. Self-actualization with its peak experience, which is you've discovered and uncovered the real truth about yourself. That is the goal. He sees this as inherently motivating. Remember, humanistic psychologists believe that human beings are inherently motivated to self-fulfillment, to getting to that next level, to striving for growth. It's a part of who we are. It is its own motivation. Again, the empirical basis of that, the proof of that, it's pretty shaky. It's kind of you believe it or you don't, almost kind of a religious type thing to it. Moving on to stuff about hunger, and of course we are motivated to eat a lot. And you know, what makes us eat? I mean, it should be obvious, we're hungry, but well, what makes us hungry? First of all, stuff in the brain. There are two type parts of the hypothalamus. We'll come to them a little bit later that have a lot to do with it. Glucostats, and I barely know what these are. You know, this is not my strong area. These are neurons that are sensitive to glucose. And in other words, if there are a lot of them there, that would make you more or less hungry, etc. Hormones as well. Insulin increases hunger. Leptin signals that there are fat stores and decreases hunger. So if you have a lot of fat and a lot of leptin signaling that, your body gets the message, I'm not going to be eaten anymore. Question that often comes up, are there experiments with finding ways to inject or synthesize leptin or something similar to leptin that could reduce hunger? And I'm sure the answer is yes, but I don't know the details behind it. There's your buddy, the hypothalamus, looking like a little plate of lima beans, which, come to think of it, is sort of disgusting. So we have two parts of it, the lateral hypothalamus, and we have the ventromedial thalamus. Notice, if you destroy the lateral hypothalamus, the animal becomes little. In other words, it simply will not eat. It has no interest in doing this. So you destroy the lateral hypothalamus, the animal will become little. However, the ventromedial hypothalamus, which suppresses hunger, you destroy that, and the animal becomes very large, very big. So there's the V little mnemonic device, a natural language mediator. Lateral, destroy it, it becomes little. Destroy the ventromedial, it becomes very big. Think about that. That actually did show up a few years ago in an FRQ that made students very unhappy. You'd be ready for it. Yet glucose level in the blood is maintained. Insulin decreases glucose in the blood, which makes us feel hungry. If there's anybody listening to this right now that is one of those people that when you need to eat, you need to eat, and woe betide those who are with you when you're hungry. For a number of years, I dated somebody who was like that. Perfectly delightful person, but when she became hungry, God help us all. I got to the point that I was carrying around food. You know, that wasn't her just being grouchy. She had very, very low blood glucose levels. And when she was hungry, by God, it was time to eat. So glucose in the system makes you feel hungry, or lack of it, I should say. Levels of glucose are monitored by these glucostats, these neurons in the stomach, the liver, again, this is all stuff I don't think you particularly see on the exam, but FYI, it is there. There certainly is this biological motivation behind eating. And this is pretty fascinating because, and there's something I'm hoping we'll read later this year. Ordinarily, we would have already, about obesity. The title of the article is Everything You've Ever Known About Obesity is Wrong. This is one of the more unfair things about it. It's called set point theory. And the bottom line is that you get to a point in your life in which your weight is kind of set. You may have relatives who have tried to lose weight, for example, and what you'll find is that they manage to lose the weight and then they put it back on. It is extraordinarily difficult long-term to lose weight and keep it off, particularly when you get to a single age. And part of the reason is this. You're born with a certain number of fat cells. If you add fat, you add more fat cells. Fat cells themselves, however, do not ever disappear. They simply become smaller. In other words, they're hungry fat cells. What do hungry fat cells tell you to do? To eat more. The other part of it, too, is your metabolism. Your metabolism is about how quickly you burn calories. I could eat a certain number of calories, you could eat more, I could put on weight, you could lose weight. And that's just simply because our bodies are different. Once we have lost weight, our metabolism slows down. Meaning, if we are eating a certain number of calories a day, getting a certain amount of exercise, and slowly losing a little weight, eventually that same exercise and calorie level will be not enough to lose weight, and we might actually gain it back again. So it's called the set point. That also works for emotions, as you'll see too. The idea that we have kind of like a set level of so-called happiness or contentment, something wonderful happens in our life, we feel great for a while, but we regress to the mean. And that's really another way of thinking about it too, regression to the mean. We have this with weight. Again, we'll probably read that article later in this year, and I think it's pretty interesting. I think it speaks to a lot of us, whether we are people that struggle at all with weight gain or do not, or whatever else. It's pretty interesting stuff. Yeah, here's what I'm talking about with the fat cells. We have about 30 or 40 million, and if you begin to put on a lot of weight, you create more fat cells. The number might even double. But here's the thing. Once you have these fat cells, they do not disappear. It doesn't matter how much you diet. They don't die off. They simply become smaller, i.e. hungrier, and they induce you to keep eating. Again, the reason why it is so difficult to lose weight and to keep it off. Now that said, any given time that somebody says, I'm 80 pounds overweight and I'm going to lose it and keep it off, on a given time, you're not likely to do it. At the same time, there are a number of people, a lot of people out there who really used to be very heavy and took it off. It's a little bit like smoking cigarettes. If you've ever watched somebody try to stop smoking, it's really hard to stop. And most efforts to quit smoking do fail. However, we all know plenty of ex-smokers who don't smoke anymore. So if it happens enough, there is that possibility of it happening. But it is tricky. Yeah, again, same thing here. When reduced calories, we lose a certain amount of weight. However, at that point, the metabolism slows down, and the same number of calories could actually cause you to gain weight. And genetics, no question about it. I think one of the things that we need to get over is judging people for how they put on weight. My father's an example. My father came from a very, very, very heavy family, and he was, as a kid, he was fairly big as a small child. The whole time that I knew him until he died, I don't recall him. I mean, he was always dieting. He exercised, ran 5 miles a day all the way until his mid-70s, incredibly careful. I mean, never saw him like at a party eating cake or anything like that. He was so cautious about everything he ate. And my dad was always going to be about 30 or 40 pounds over his ideal weight. Occasionally, I remember a few times growing up where he'd lose a little bit of weight, but it would come right back. And again, the twin studies are the gold standard for all of these things. if you have an identical twin, genetically identical twin who is obese, you are likely to be as well. It's not absolutely, because there are environmental conditions as well too, but it plays a huge role in it. And again, one of the reasons, and again, this will be in this article, advice for some cases when people are overweight, what do you do? Maybe stop beating yourself up. Eat as healthily as you can, exercise, live a healthy life. There are a lot of people, very, very thin people out there who are not necessarily healthier. I mean, it's agreed, you're carrying an extra 100, 150 pounds. That can lead to some health issues. It does correlate with diabetes and so forth. But the mere fact that somebody is somewhat heavier does not mean by any means that they're less healthy. I have an extremely high cholesterol count, and I've always been pretty darn thin throughout my life. So, if your genes are making you heavy, you can either be miserable about it, or you can say, you know what, I'm heavier than the average person in my group. Great, I like myself. And there's a lot to be said for that, a lot of work being done with that, with people feeling body positive while maintaining a healthy lifestyle, etc. And one of the things that we are seeing, throughout all of human history, if you were heavy, if you had a lot of fat, if you were obese, well, that was a status symbol. It meant you were eating, that you were not working yourself to the bone, that you had a comfortable life. We are seeing increasingly that's not the case anymore. The last 50 years or so, especially in Western countries and especially in the United States, you're starting to see, this massive negative correlation between wealth and body weight. The wealthier you are, the less body fat you have, the lower your weight, etc. And of course, that has to do with the types of work people do, the amount that they have to work, the ability to afford, good food, exercise, etc. If you're working 2 jobs just to pay the rent, to hope you can keep a roof over your kid's head, you're not going to be going to the club on the weekends and exercising. You're going to grab something very, very quickly, processed foods, etc. One of the great criminal things, I think, in the United States now is with all these dollar stores, you're finding that supermarkets don't exist in poor areas anymore, because the stuff that's really good for you, the fresh fruits and vegetables, those things go rotten. You don't make a lot of money of them. Those shops are being replaced by the places that just have these, packaged, it's in a box, it's in a little packet, people eat it, and almost always worse for you, high in simple carbohydrates, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, heritability, again, remember what heritability means and does not mean. If you were to look at this and say, oh, the heritability of weight is, let's say, 0.6 or 60%, to put it another way, that does not mean that 60% of your weight comes from genes and the other 40 comes from your environment and your diet. No, absolutely not. It means if you're from a common population, a population of people sharing things in common, when there's a difference in weight between 2 people of, say, the same height, probably 60% of that difference overall would be attributable to genes, 40% to environment. Doesn't really work with individuals. It means with overall in a society. But that's a very, very different thing than saying, oh, 60% of your weight is determined by genetics, because that's absolutely not what heritability is. Environmental factors, all of this. Look, there are things that we learn. There are things that early on kids grow to love, etc. One of the good moves we made with Seffi, just didn't drink soda, did not drink carbonated sugary beverages when she was young. She has no interest at all. Occasionally she'll drink a little Coke at a party and it's like, ooh, that's awful. If you grew up drinking it, I knew of somebody graduated a few years ago that literally drank 2 or 3 Cokes a day while at school. That's what mom packed, and that kid couldn't get off it, etc. Now, we do know that sweet and salty tastes are almost universal. Now, are there individuals that don't like them? Yes, but these are things there, and there certainly are reasons for that biologically. Sweet things will add calories, will put weight on you when food supplies are less secure, et cetera, et cetera. Whether traditions, ideals of beauty, again, in today's world, the woman wants to be 5'11" and weigh 31 kilos or something like that. I exaggerate a lot on that, but the super, super thin is quote unquote healthy, beautiful. Actually, that's not quite as true. when we start looking into this. That's not actually what people find to be attractive or ideal. But there is that ideal that that's what it should be. Shouldn't have any excess fat, et cetera, et cetera. You rarely hear people say, oh my goodness, I'm getting so skinny. You don't hear that. You hear, oh, I'm getting so fat. Now, that's not true in a lot of cultures. Historically, that was not the case. And there are parts of the world today, too, where being super thin is just not seen as being appealing any more than certain skin tone or color hair or whatever else. I remember they did this experiment when I was a little tiny kid. I was like third grade or something, in which they were giving us cookies, the local university, but some of them were colored blue and some were kind of an unpleasant kind of yellowish green color. And they were trying to determine, did that make a difference? You might ask yourself, do you like chocolate? And you say, yes. Yes, I do. If I offered you some chocolate, would you eat it? Yes. Yes, I would. What if it was shaped like doggy do? Unbelievably realistic. Ooh. Well, why? It's chocolate. I mean, I'm not going to give you a doggy do, right? But yeah, that can make a big difference. And quite the opposite, you don't have to be hungry. You can just say, oh, that looks so good, or it smells so good, or whatever else. And really interesting, there are people that respond to stress by not eating. That tends to be me. That's sometimes my life where I've had a lot of anxiety about things. I just kind of stop eating altogether. Others, they go for it. Oh my God, what a stressful period. Bring on the pizza, bring on the pizza. The carbohydrates, and this is interesting, simple carbohydrates have been shown to be a factor in producing more serotonin. What is serotonin? Well, serotonin, of course, that neurotransmitter that, among other things, is a mood regulator. It is the happy neurotransmitter. In other words, that makes sense. I'm feeling stressed, unhappy, and I eat pizza, which creates the chemical in me that makes me feel better. Absolutely, that's a very normal thing. So if any of you are folks that say, oh, God, during exam time or when I'm having a problem with the parents, I just want to eat and eat, that is biologically a very sensible response. I love this. Just take a minute to look at it. And actually, before you do, let me ask you this. I want you to stop and make a list of 3 types of food, 3 ethnic foods from different parts of the world where you say, those people eat a really spicy diet. Okay, stop the film. And you're back. Now, I don't think anybody said, oh, German food, or English food. Hey, we're having boiled pizza tonight, or whatever those people eat. Of course not. Where are the spicy foods? Oh, Thai food, or Indonesian food, or Mexican food, the habanero, etc. You will notice that the foods that are insanely spicy tend to be from tropical countries, tend to be from areas around the equator, tend to be not from Northern Europe, etc. Now, reason behind this, and you will notice this is suggesting the year-round colder temperatures have food that is simply not as spicy. And that's a pretty serious correlation. That's maybe a 0.6, 0.7, something like that. I mean, for the most part, the hotter the year-round temperature, the more spicy the food. Now, why might that be? I mean, it could just be, of course, if we're thinking long-term stuff, it could just be, things that are hot and spicy grow in tropical areas. But I bet it's more than that. One thing that we know about extremely spicy foods, certain types of chili peppers and so forth, they have antibacterial qualities to them. In other words, you eat the super, super, super spicy food and it kills bacteria. Now, if you happen to have a pet microbe, you come home with every day. Its name is Fluffy, right? You go home and play with Fluffy the microbe every day. If you ever want Fluffy to do really, really well, take him to the tropics. Take him to warm, moist weather. Why? Because bacteria and other microbes, they survive, they do incredibly well there. What this is probably getting at, you probably piece this together, the areas with the high temperatures that have maybe a larger number of microbes that survive, that prosper, that make people sick, over the years, and I'm not talking about 20 years, 50, 100, I'm talking over tens of thousands of years, people recognized eating really spicy food kept them healthier. And this is at least one of the theories as to why the closer to the equator you go and the higher the year-round temperature, the spicier the food. Isn't that cool? I just think that's so cool. Move on quickly to eating disorders. We could have done this in the prior unit as well too. In fact, we will have already talked about it this year as I reverse these last two. Anorexia nervosa, again, somebody who is normal or underweight continually loses weight but feels overweight. Now, this is very much a Western conception. In the Crazy Like Us book, Ethan Waters describes how in, for example, China over the years, there was almost no history whatsoever of anorexia. Until in the 1990s, a young girl that began to become concerned about her body weight started starving herself more and more and more, and it proved to be, sadly, in this girl's case, fatal. So a psychologist, I believe from Hong Kong, started looking through the records and said, you know what, this has never happened in China. And I think over the previous 50 years, he had found like a dozen cases in which women, and it was all women, I believe in this case, had stopped eating to the point that it was killing them or coming very close to this. But in none of those cases did it seem to have anything to do at all with body image. And that's kind of fascinating. This is a place where, that available symptom pool, you're feeling this great distress in yourself and you look for a way to express that, not necessarily consciously. Anorexia does appear to have a major cultural component to it. But important to note, anorexia, by the way, lots of people out there are very thin, does not mean that they're anorexic. Absolutely not. And that's something to keep in mind. We can't judge that. Sure, you have a friend you're very concerned about, he or she, and it is more often she, never seems to eat, seems to be losing weight. That might be friend to friend. Look, I'm really worried about you, etc., and maybe even reaching out to somebody else. But if you look around the classroom and say, wow, he or she is really thin, there's a pretty good chance that he or she is just really thin, and that's all there is to it. Bulimia, somewhat different, well, quite a bit different. Um, First of all, tends to be, and again, more women than men, but the first bulimic I ever met in my life was somebody I went to middle school with. It was a male named Mike. And so it's not as if it's only, but it does tend to be more female than male. And generally tends to be somebody, a woman who is somewhat either at normal body weight or somewhat over, not that skeletal thin thing. This is somebody who is constantly working to get that weight off, which again can be a good thing if it involves eating healthily and exercising and all of that, but in an irrational way, to the point of starving themselves for weeks on end and not eating. And then what invariably happens, they are out in public, usually with other people, and they just can't resist and they go hog wild and just eat what they can. And then this, oh my God, I've destroyed my diet. And they get to a point where they try to purge this, either through taking extreme numbers of laxatives or more commonly or more famously inducing vomiting. It's called the binge and purge. Binge and purge, where you let your guard down, eat, and then you got to get rid of it. Now, anorexia can be fatal. And if it's untreated and left to this, it can absolutely destroy a person. Bulimia, almost never fatal, but certainly a whole bunch of things from, stomach acids in the esophagus that can create trouble, to malnutrition because you're eating a lot, but you're not absorbing the nutrients, and obviously the psychological and social aspect of it as well. And this gets to be tricky, and I'll kind of leave these up here without going into them, but various reasons for eating disorders. Again, if somebody has an eating disorder, that does not mean that any of these things are true, but they appear to be at least potentially causal or to some degree correlated with. Again, if you're interested in looking into more specifically how well correlated, I'd encourage that you do that, but that goes a little bit beyond the realm of what we're doing here. Yeah, this is pretty fascinating. Take a moment to look at this. Stop the video, look at this, try to ascertain what's going on. Okay, we're back. We're assuming that you got off. And we see from heavy to very, very, very thin. And this is obviously not a specific study, but kind of an example of what you'd see. You'd see that women tend to think gosh, I wish I looked like this. Not quite rail thin, but really close. And well, maybe that's a little bit much, but the average man would still want me a lot thinner than I am. But in reality, that is, at least on average, not what men wanted. Men, when interviewed, seemed to prefer something that was somewhat heavier than both what women thought that men wanted and certainly what women felt that they ought to be. And again, it's personal things. Some people are attracted to tall, short, heavier, thinner, etc. It's culturally different, it's individually different. But something to remember that if you're at least growing up in a Western culture as a woman, you probably have an idea that you should be thinner than is either good for you or that you look your best or that others, would prefer. So there's Seffi. Hi, Seffi. Hi. Always good to see Seffi. And again, you'll see this every time. I really think, you come down to a question, an FRQ might be helpful to think about this. The biological, the psychological, and the sociocultural has to do with every type of motivation, every type of behavior. I like these little charts. You can stop and take a look at it if you'd like. All right, we're going to move on to the naughty stuff, sexual motivation and behavior. Look, some of it absolutely just boils down to, some of it's just biological, others not. We do know that hormones, and of course in males it is primarily testosterone. Surprise to many, it's also in females. It is more testosterone than it is estrogen that is the primary sexual motivator. Now there's very little estrogen in men, and estrogen plays a role in women as well too. And certainly, teenagers tend to be more sexually motivated, at least in terms of their thoughts and everything else, at an older age. And a large part of that is that hormonal surge. It's a different body that you're working with at the age of, 13, 14, 15 than you were at 9 or 10, or certainly at my age. Notice that it does play a role, to be sure. Much less so, however, than animals. And as mentioned, human beings have a frontal lobe. During the spring, you might notice doggies doing very, very, very naughty things in the street. You walk by and your mom covers your eyes, etc. You don't tend to see people do that an awful lot. And that's a big part of it. The desire may be there, brought on by the hormones and other factors, but the frontal lobe says maybe this is not a good idea. Culturally, erotic images, we can call it pornography, we can call it art, we can call it whatever we want to, absolutely affects women, but does tend to affect more. Males are much more driven by the visual side of things, etc. Lots of debate about pornography, different types of it, erotic photography, erotic film, etc., what kind of impact that has. Does it change attitudes? Does it change expectations? And again, a lot of debate about that. Individual freedom to produce whatever films you want to and consume what you want to versus overall impact upon society. I say many times that psychology is the science of the bleeding obvious. Level of attraction to a partner. Okay, you might want to stop and take notes on this. Okay, this is pretty complicated. If you are heavily attracted to a partner, you will tend to have more sexual desire for that partner. I know, right? I mean, who would have guessed that? How about that? Added to this, though, and this is a delightful story, it's called the Coolidge effect. Those of you who are taking U.S. history might have come across a president just before the Great Depression named Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, called Silent Cal. He didn't talk, had very little personality, somehow got roped into going out to a farm with his wife. And he and his wife went out, it's one of those photo things. You go out and you kiss a pig and they take pictures of you and you seem like a man of the person as the president. One of those things. I'm sure Coolidge absolutely hated that. Well, at one point, one of the farmers grabbed the first lady, not literally, but called her aside and did something kind of risque for the 1920s. Said, Miss Coolidge, this may sound a bit impolite, but do you see that rooster over there? Why, yes. Well, I would like you to know that that rooster is capable of having relations up to 4 or 5 times a day. And Mrs. Coolidge said, oh, well, I'll have to tell that to Mr. Coolidge. Very, very naughty moment for the 1920s, right? Well, the same farmer who is really pushing the envelope got with the president, Mr. President Coolidge, I'm afraid this is a little bit impolite, but I had just mentioned to your wife that rooster over there can have relations up to 4 to 5 times a day, and she said that I should let you know about that. And Coolidge says, well, let me ask you something. Is it with the same hen or a different hen? I said, oh, well, it's with different hens. He said, you need to tell that to Mrs. Coolidge. And this is true, that if you are with the same established partner for many, many months, years, even decades, the intense desire to engage in those behaviors that we shouldn't talk about tend to be not as strong. Whereas when you're new into a relationship with a new partner, there's more of a drive. And that's, again, been pretty much shown to be true. Not always true with every individual out there, of course not, but as general tendencies. And yes, males and females. Women have a sex drive. Women are naturally motivated for sex. That wouldn't make sense. The female orgasm wouldn't exist if it were not part of the biological plan. Men, on average, have a stronger sex drive. Again, I told you about that study from about 30 years ago in which they took a average-looking female who walked up to men across the university campus and said, hi, I've been looking at you. You seem really nice. Wonder, would you like to get together to have sex later tonight? And not all the men said yes, but a large number of them said, yes, I think I would enjoy that. They tried the same thing with an average-looking male approaching females, and there was not a single. Now, it may not be that that this is less desire on behalf of the women. I mean, it could be that it's potentially more dangerous. Men are bigger and stronger. There's reputational stuff, etc., which unfortunately plays a role. But I think as we've discussed over time, too, there may be an evolutionary factor that, in theory, any male listening to my voice could produce 300, 400, 500 offspring in the next year. Please don't do that. But my point is that you could, and therefore, at an evolutionary level, it makes sense to have as many partners as you possibly can to keep your gene pool alive and thriving, et cetera, et cetera. For, of course, the females who are listening to this, in the next year, you can really have one. That's about it. So you're going to be a little bit more cautious, the theory goes, the evolutionary theory, with, what you do with those ova. Every single one of your eggs is fairly valuable and fairly rare. And you know what? You're going to release about 350 of them in your lifetime. You want to be a little bit more cautious. By the way, one of the great concerns with evolutionary psychology, are you saying, men can't control themselves and they just, you have to just let them do whatever they want to do? I think that's pretty much nonsense. I think most people get why it's nonsense, because obviously we have frontal lobes. You can say I have an evolutionarily based drive toward doing something. Doesn't mean that you have to act on it. Okay, mentioned this already. You can look at this on your own. But testosterone levels, yes, absolutely plays a role. There's Seppi. Can you close the door, Seppi? Seppi has just gone into the bathroom in the hotel room, so. Well, what am I supposed to do? I mean, like all of a sudden they hear a toilet flush, then you leave the door open? Okay. Masters and Johnson, yeah, this is some pretty naughty stuff, guys. So, a couple of professors, and again, they're not big weirdos. They were genuinely interested, wanted to understand the human sexual response. So they put ads in the paper offering money to anybody that would come into their laboratory and engage in a variety of sexual behaviors with somebody watching through a two-way mirror with little, measuring devices put in some key areas to measure the physiological response, etc. And that is something that happens, over those, that's what they do over this time. Now, there are some big problems with this because, of course, those who are willing to be witnessed having sex or have sex with a stranger or even a partner for money tend to be sort of an unusual group. So I would say that we lose the random sampling of the overall population that's been acknowledged. But they call this the human sex response, and it's true for men and women. And you can take a look at this as well, but it's a regular stage that human beings go through. Again, you may look at what we're seeing here, very similar for men and women. Yeah, they absolutely, in most ways, are very, very similar. Difference might be that the female will often spend more time at the plateau level. The orgasm happens with the male, and it's fairly difficult for that to happen again, whereas with females it can happen repeatedly over time, etc. Yeah, the gender gap in terms of orgasm consistency, reaching a climax during sex. And you'll notice that for males, it simply is more common. Now, is that a biological reason behind that, that the female orgasm is not necessary for procreation? Yeah, that may be part of it. That, you know, the release of sperm simply has to happen regardless. You will notice it's kind of interesting, though, as you start seeing the numbers going up with females. And a large part of that, I think, is probably just comfort level, that there is so much societal baggage around women's sexuality that perhaps initially it becomes this sort of tense thing and a woman gets to know her now self more. Noticing that they always have an orgasm. And by the way, there's nothing that says that it is not a worthwhile endeavor if you don't have an orgasm. That's not necessarily the only goal of all of this, but it is easier and more common for men across the age group. We talk about sex crimes, we talk about sexual abuse, etc. This is something that surprises a lot of people. When we think about sexual assault, we think about rape. It usually, the thing in people's mind is somebody breaking into a house, an unknown stranger, and you see how incredibly, incredibly rare this is. And it usually is somebody known to the person. Men can be sexually assaulted as well. It is rarer. Probably less motivation with men because most men, of course, are, you know, heterosexual or opposite sex oriented. And then there's also just the physical size that, you know, men are bigger, stronger creatures on average than females. But this is something that makes, you know, to be very, very cautious about, particularly as you move on into your adult life. It's not so much somebody you don't know breaking in, it's somebody that you thought you knew, somebody that you thought you had a relationship with. Obviously very cautious about that. You know what, I'm just going to skip this. I'm looking at the time, kind of going on too long, but you can stop and take a look at it if you wish to. Yes, men more think about sex more than females on average. Again, female that thinks more about sex or is more sexually motivated than male, there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's just atypical more than anything else. You know, again, this is kind of interesting because we had this tendency, oh, men are nothing like women, et cetera, et cetera. And you will notice that on both these things, here is the mean ratings of importance of financial prospects. And the idea is that, you know, women are going to be concerned about their offspring having support. So having a man who is stable, who is able to provide for the child, hence in the modern world, having good financial prospects will be valuable. And you know what? It does seem to matter more with women than it does with men, but it also matters to men. It's not as if men have no interest at all in the financial background or prospects of the female. And then you notice this is the same thing, but it's the importance of physical attractiveness. And yes, it does seem to be around the world, all kinds of different cultures, more important for males than females. And I believe that's true in every society I've ever heard of, but it's not as if it doesn't matter to females at all. And it's fairly close in most of these places. So I had this great illusions growing up. It's like, well, I'm pretty funny looking, but fortunately, women don't care. Turns out they did care, which explains a lot of no answers to that. Would you like to go out? No, you're funny looking. But I thought you women didn't care, and they would have a good laugh at that. And you know, I went off and watched TV. Yeah, good enough. All worked out okay. Happy to have Sherry here. Sexually transmitted diseases, again, part of sexual motivation. Here's one of the downsides of it. One of the things that we know, of course, is without sexual activity, sexually transmitted diseases don't happen. It's fairly obvious. People start sexual activity at different ages, to be sure. One of the things that we know is that when people start earlier, there tends to be more of a lifetime risk of STDs and or unwanted pregnancy. And in some ways that makes sense, that somebody who is 14, 15 years old, that's a lot to take on, and being able to make the right decisions in a calm and rational way. It does get easier as you get older. One of the things, though, that we know about what correlates negatively with sexual activity in teens, higher intelligence tends to delay sex, more religious teens tend to delay sex, a father's presence in the home, that's both true for girls and for boys, and team-based learning programs as well have all been shown to have at least a negative, i.e., good effect upon reducing teen sexual behavior. Why is it, given what we know about STDs and pregnancy, if a teenager is not going to use contraceptive, not going to use a condom, not going to use any form of birth control, how come? Well, one thing is ignorance. You assume that, how could anybody not know how babies are made? You would be surprised. There are a lot of myths out there. Oh, as long as he holds his breath. I mean, I've literally heard these types of things for sure. I think number two, guilt related, of course, because, especially when you're younger in life, this is something I shouldn't be doing. This is wrong. I just don't even want to think about this. And particularly if you're feeling guilty, that doesn't really enhance communication. Hi, you know what? I feel very, very tense and uncomfortable with this, and I feel tremendous feelings of guilt. So let's have a conversation about what we're going to, that's just not going to happen. Alcohol use, absolutely. And this has been pretty well documented, and something particularly as you move off into university life the next couple of years, heads up, we don't always make the best decisions when we've been drinking. And of course, always questions about what media normalizes. Again, different studies suggest different things in this, but we don't really have time to go into that. Sexual orientation. I remember growing up and reading, 1 in 10 people are gay or bisexual. I remember thinking, boy, that was the party line, but it didn't make sense to me. It didn't seem like it was that common. I mean, I knew kids in high school who, in retrospect, absolutely were gay. And, I even sort of knew it then, even though it wasn't something people talked about. And I certainly knew more people in college, but in no ways did the 1 in 10 make sense. And that number is actually way too high. That number came from the 1950s, a guy named Alfred Kinsey, who used to, I think, specialize in a certain type of wasp. He was an entomologist and then moved into human sexual response, did a whole bunch of interviews with people in which they asked them the most private questions. It was the first widespread, detailed study of American sexual behavior, really, that had ever been allowed to happen. His numbers came up with 1 in 10, and it turned out that it just simply wasn't accurate. One of the things is when we even talk about same-sex attraction, how do you identify when somebody is gay, when somebody is LGBT? Is it a matter of, well, you know what, I sleep only with people of the same sex? Okay, I'm pretty safe saying that would be somebody that I would describe as gay or lesbian or however you might describe it. Well, what about if it's somebody that on occasion had done that, but it's not something they're currently doing? Or what about somebody who has never had any type of sexual contact, but thinks about it constantly and denies it themselves, but they know that's what they want? Well, what about somebody who has a dream some night, a homosexual dream? Well, where exactly are we putting somebody? And it appears that Kinsey was including people that might have had some questions about their sexual preference or maybe had a one-off encounter of some degree. Probably what we're looking about is maybe about 3% plus or minus among males, a little bit less with women. It does appear that culturally bisexuality is growing somewhat. I've seen some studies suggesting this. It seems to exist in absolutely every culture since recorded history. It's very much accepted in some cultures, it's not in others. But the fact that it is so absolutely universal, again, suggests there almost has to be a biological causation behind that. Again, here's the continuum, etc. There are people that are absolutely, exclusively heterosexual. It doesn't mean they're even anti-gay. It can just mean like, I absolutely cannot imagine being attracted to somebody of the same sex. And I've known some people that said, boy, when I was 3 years old, I didn't even know what attraction was. but I knew who I was, and that was apparent to me. And many more of us are here somewhere in the middle. Again, where exactly is that line drawn? You know, the good basketball player and the bad basketball player. At what point on this continuum do you now become bisexual, homosexual, questioning? There's no real answer to that, of course. Yeah, it seems to be, again, they've not found the gay gene, but there are absolute differences. There's another part of the hypothalamus, for example, that is considerably smaller in gay men. Less studies, by the way, of gay women, partly because the hard and biological sciences have been, more male dominated, so there may be more interest. Also seems to be a little bit more common among men than women, so maybe more interest there. It does not appear, though, in cases in which couples of the same sex who are married or partners that have adopted foster children, it just doesn't seem that you can quote unquote turn a kid gay through family relations or through exposure. It just doesn't really work that way as far as we can tell with all of this. Yeah, this is something I always smile. My first year teaching AP psychology, I had a young man whose name was Wendell Mays, and you can't quite see this, but Wendell was, to his credit, openly gay, very much accepted by all of his friends. It was just not an issue at that school that I taught. And he was sort of half in, half out on AP Psych, paid attention sometimes, but he absolutely loved this because there are examples in the animal world of same-sex attraction and same-sex sexual behavior. And in fact, you see a couple birds, one of whom was named Wendell, and Wendell, my student, was just delighted by that. In the world of people having too much time in their hands, genetic scientists have actually altered the genes of fruit flies. Fruit flies, little things that appear like in the kitchen when you've left some, avocados out for too long or whatever, that can make them begin to become more sexually attracted, or at least spending time with other fruit flies of the same sex. So there almost certainly is some genetic causation there. Certainly biological factors. This gets tricky because on one hand you might say, hey, look, if it's genetic, if it's biological, there's no judgment. It's how people are. If I have high blood pressure, who's going to judge me for that? If I'm attracted to somebody of the same sex, who's going to judge me? Of course, the negative side of that is you find people saying, oh, well, if we can just identify what that gene is, we can genetically engineer, and, so it is definitely a double-edged sword in that case. Yeah, in gay men, the size of the anterior hypothalamus is smaller, and the anterior commissure is larger. I don't know what part of the brain that is, but there seem to be brain size differences. There seem to be some differences. Is it genetically caused? Is it prenatal hormones? I'm really not up on the research on that, but certainly, and I have known, enough people throughout my 57 years in which they just said, yes, I've always known this is who I am. This is not something I learned. This is how I am. It's like, oh, okay, great. Yeah, again, we see this. It seems to run in families, absolutely. We know that if there are two identical twins and one is gay, the other is more likely to be as well. Not absolutely, and I've actually known a couple of identical twins, one of whom is gay, one of whom is not, etc. And yeah, engineering fruit flies. And I'd say, well, that's fruit flies. And fruit flies are about 60% genetically identical to human beings. I just read that the other day, so yeah, seems to apply. Prenatal hormones. This seems to be the case. In fact, something I believe, could be wrong about this, within the woman's uterus, the hormonal system is different during a second and third pregnancy. And I believe I remember reading that it is more common for a second or third child to be same-sex attracted than a first. And some of that may be hormonal. Remember, genetic includes biological, but something biological does not have to be genetic. Okay, and you can take a look at this it's an all-in-one type thing. And this is such an old chart, I won't spend time with this, but I do know when I was in high school in 1982, when I graduated, there is no way any young person in my school could have been openly gay and been able, really would have just been hounded mercilessly. When I started teaching in the late 1990s, It was an unusual thing, I suppose, but the moment I brought up any of these issues in class, there was usually a guy that made some kind of a comment, and that guy was normally pretty shut down, like, hey, shut up, my uncle's gay, you don't talk about him, it's not really any of your business. And I think we are certainly, your generation is moving to a point where whatever an individual's personal feelings are, or personal interest, it's not something that people are terribly concerned about. I mean, I don't know. The vast majority of students that I've talked to, at least here, have said, hey, if two people are happy with each other, that's just not really my concern, which, full disclosure, that's exactly how I think it should be. Okay, yeah, do this. Yes, once again, remember with these, if you see a chart like this, is this evidence of a biological or genetic causation of any factor? Oh, absolutely, because when people are 100% genetically related, the correlation is really strong. But then again, it's not 100%, so there have to be environmental factors, there have to be hormonal factors. There's a whole theory right now of genes called epigenetics, which means things that may happen during a lifetime. It's as if like your genes have little switches, like a light switch, and oh, you have the genetic tendency, but it didn't get flicked on by your individual experience. Hence, you don't have that part of your phenotype, your outward display of it. You may have the gay genes, but it doesn't come out because things in your life never switch this, never flip that switch on. Finally, a last type is called need for achievement. And kind of interesting, Dave McClellan is the guy behind this. Can it be measured? And it's often through projective tests, the Rorschach, the thematic apperceptitude. I don't know why this is spinning around, it just happened. One of the ways this has been done over the year is to show pictures of people and have people tell stories. Well, what do you mean? Let me show you. People write out the story. And it looks like this. And you might stop yourself and say, hey, what's happening here? What's happening? And I can stop it and come up with a story if you want, or just get through with this. I was hoping to bring it in at an hour, and I think that's going to happen. But who is this person? What's happening? Obviously, it's ambiguous. There's no way of knowing. Well, here's what the research has shown. People with high NACH, high need for achievement, when they look at a picture like this, it will tend to be the story of somebody who's ambitious, somebody who's thinking about the future, somebody who's making plans, like he's on his way to a business meeting, he's on his way to, he's about to learn if he's going to be admitted to college, she's working in this so she can start her own business. There is the stories that you project onto ambiguous pictures tend to suggest an interest in achieving. And again, that's not a biological drive. That would be arousal theory. That would be something that is just out there through social cues. Low NACH, just the opposite. Pressure. He's just learned his flight is canceled. He's not doing very well. His wife has just said that he's leaving him, etc. He's telling his wife that he's not coming home because da-da-da-da-da. He's making up a story. All of these things tend, again, I don't know too much about the studies, but a low need for achievement. For those who are high in NACH, you know what? The desire to succeed is its motivation. Pleasure in success, that's what matters. It is being driven, although again, watch out for the word drive, because again, what does drive mean? Drive means biological. Confidence in abilities, etc. This is what the research shows. The people that tend to tell the stories through other psychometric measurements have been shown to have all of these qualities. Setting realistic goals. This is interesting. One might think that if you were a high need for achievement 6th grader, you would take AP Calculus. No, wait, let's think about this. Because if you are a 6th grader and you're so driven and you're taking AP Calculus, you're setting yourself up for failure. You're not going to succeed. So setting goals that are above you, but they are realistic, tends to be the quality of people with NACH. People low NACH, you can probably figure this out. It's not hope for success, it's fear of failure. And that tends to be the main motivator, at least that's what the research tells about. And they have experience of this for sure. They're afraid of the downside. In other words, they're not motivated by what could happen. They're motivated by what could happen. And that seems to be the case. Yeah, and they will set goals that are either so easy. Oh, well, I don't know. I have to take a math test. I hope, I'm going to do the one that's like, single digit addition problems, or might be the ones that would throw themselves into AP calculus as a sixth grader, because there comes the failure. And I love this. Take a minute. If you're still with me, I know it's been 60 minutes. I guess I'm going to miss by a minute or two. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, I used to know how to pronounce the name. About every 2 years, I go back and try to get it. But flow theory, I love this. Take a look at it and see if you can figure this out. So what Mikhail is doing is describing what he calls flow. And I want you to think about something that you're probably very intrinsically motivated in, like it's something you love doing. If there are any artists here or musicians or people that just have a great love of the written word, like you love reading or you love learning or you love running or athletic the specialty or you name it, have you ever had that experience where you're engaged in it and it's almost like you're in a trance? I mean, like you just come out of it and say, how did 2 hours go by like this? I don't remember this. Like I was just so completely, utterly engaged in it. That is flow. And you know what? That might be the meaning of life, if there is one. The more of that you can have in your life where you feel so totally, totally engaged, that outside noise and that clock on the wall, they just don't matter because you are so fulfilled by what you're doing. Notice how in this simple little axiom, he says, well, look, if you have really low skills, you're not very good at something, and it's incredibly challenging. Well, that creates a lot of anxiety. Or if you have low skills, you're terrible at something, and there's no challenge, whatever. Well, what if you're incredibly good at something? Man, you are a math whiz, and you get a bunch of single digit addition problems, boredom. But what if you're really good at something? I mean, you're into it, you're good and getting better, and it's incredibly challenging. That's where the flow happens. That's where you're in your element. And it's a neat concept. There's been some research done on this. I think it's something everybody should explore a little bit more. Like to do that more in the coming years. This is something that appears on the exams. So heads up and just make sure you know what they mean. So when you are motivated to do something, what if there's a conflict? What if there are different things that you might do? Like, let's say you could go to the movies or go to a soccer game. Dang, I'd like to do both of those. That's called an approach conflict. Like, I'd love to do both of them, but I can't, and I gotta choose. Or even more common. Let's say you have a avoidance conflict. That's not on the slide here, but that's the lesser of two evils. I don't want to do this, but if I don't do that, I got to do this. And I really don't want to do that. And then you've also, and by the way, it's like, I really want to do this, but don't want to do that. There's no conflict. That's just, you do the thing that you're supposed to do. But then there's also, and this is probably more common, the approach avoidance conflict, in which pretty much anything you do, there are positives and negatives, and you have to kind of balance them. So you're motivated to do some things and avoid others, just to tie that in. And finally, our very last slide here. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, avoidance, and then the multiple approach avoidance conflict. There are a whole bunch of different options, and usually life is like that. It's not just one or two things. It's not A or B, it's A, B, C, and D. Wait, which are good? Well, good is such a relative term. There are good aspects toward all of these different options and have to balance them. But it is worth noticing those terms. Okay, looks like I got you at 65 minutes, which is not too bad for half of a chapter. This is normally over 2 or 3 days, but we are in a hurry this year. So, right. I will see you back in class.